One of the biggest barriers to expanding democracy and legitimizing the United States Republic is partisan gerrymandering, the process of drawing legislative districts in creative ways to overrepresent one's own political party and marginalize the opposition. It allows parties to artificially inflate their support and maintain and entrench power despite the will of the voters, and it prevents the expansion of things like voting rights, multiplying the problem in federal elections. For example, in 2018 in North Carolina, Republicans and Democrats split the statewide vote 50 to 48, but Republicans walked away with 10 of the 13 seats in the House of Representatives. It wasn't an accident. However, the Supreme Court has stopped short of saying that discriminating against voters based on their political leanings is unconstitutional. So how do we end partisan gerrymandering? This video expands on one that I posted on TikTok today in response to a question from a subscriber of mine named Ryan Martin, who has his own interesting page called Anger Professor that you should definitely check out. He asked how to address gerrymandering. My answer was, in short, that the House of Representatives could stop seating gerrymandered representatives, but let's talk about how that would actually work. State lawmakers enjoy extraordinary power in dictating the shape of the federal House of Representatives when exercising their right to draw legislative districts in their state. As a result of the Supreme Court decision in Reynolds v. Sims in 1964, states must redraw legislative districts after every census so that districts have roughly equal populations in accordance with the 14th Amendment. State lawmakers have used that redistricting mandate as an opportunity to draw districts in their partisan favor. In 2019, the Roberts Court heard a case called Rucho v. Common Cause, which challenged North Carolina's 2016 congressional map on the accusation that the map was a product of unconstitutional partisan gerrymandering. In a 5-4 decision written by Roberts, the court decided that claims against partisan gerrymandering are beyond the jurisdiction of federal courts. Roberts called gerrymandering, quote, incompatible with democratic principles, end quote, but decided that federal courts don't have the authority to determine how much partisan gerrymandering is too much. Roberts reminded us that the authority is, quote, expressly checked and balanced by federal Congress, end quote, and he's right. Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution reads, quote, each house shall be the judge of elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, end quote. In other words, it's up to the House to decide the legitimacy of elections that decide members of Congress, and the core issue of the legitimacy of House elections is the legitimacy of legislative districts from which those members are elected. Congress has exercised this power before, specifically in reaction to the matter of voter enfranchisement. At the turn of the 19th century, congressional representatives from the North were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Southern states having representatives apportioned based on a population that was unable to vote. Southern states had become so effective at disenfranchising African American citizens that they were virtually absent from the polls, but the Constitution still apportioned representation on total population. This created situations where a state like Kansas had 8 congressional representatives elected by a voting population of 425,000, while a state like Louisiana also had 8 representatives, but a voting population of only 44,000 because the black population in Louisiana was excluded from voting. In response, the House Elections Committee began to set aside the election results in these states, concluding that the elections were illegitimate without the participation of black voters. Congressman Edgar D. Crumpacker from Indiana even proposed that these states be stripped of their seats altogether, but lacked support for the measure. The Southern bloc of representatives was dedicated to keeping black voters disenfranchised. It would take another 50 years until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed before blacks regained their right to vote, but ideological descendants of the Americans who sought to undermine the 14th Amendment have found a new way to disenfranchise voters of color: partisan gerrymandering. Luckily, Crumpacker and his peers drew us the blueprint for how to fight this. The House Committee on Elections was disbanded in 1947, but there's no reason that the House can't bring it back. Remember, congressional districts aren't even in the Constitution. Up until the Apportionment Act of 1842, representatives in the House were elected by statewide elections. The Apportionment Act invented congressional districts. Congress has authority over managing them, and it can use its authority to task the renewed House Committee on Elections to not only uphold a standard on voter access, but also uphold independently drawn voting districts. States have long tested different strategies to combat partisan gerrymandering, and independent districting has proved to be the most effective strategy to date. Analyses have shown that independently drawn districts are most likely to consistently produce delegations that mirror the partisan split of that state's electorate. This makes sense, by the way. Partisans are incentivized to draw districts that maintain and entrench their power. Hire people whose specific mandate is to simply draw equal districts that make practical sense, and you're much less likely to find partisan advantage in those districts. However, the fact remains that politicians are highly unlikely to institute independent commissions on their own volition. There's simply too much to be gained by partisan districting. Congress can change that by exercising their Article 1, Section 5 powers and establishing an ultimatum. A state may only have representation in the federal House of Representatives if that state establishes an independent redistricting commission that produces independent districts. A fair incentive, if you ask me. Thanks for watching, and thanks for staying subscribed to the channel. Please hit the like button to increase the chances that others will see this video too, and share it with your friends if they happen to be political nerds like us. Follow me on TikTok if you don't already, and check out my podcast, The Third. It's not as political as my YouTube and TikTok content, it's a bit more personal, but the early reviews are positive. I'd like to hear what you think. It's available on all major podcatchers. Links to all of this will be in the description below. I have plenty of fun new content planned for you all, so keep an eye out. See you soon.